Welcome to Chapter 19, The Growing Pains of Urbanization. Growth is a good thing, except when it's unplanned. That's what the United States experienced in the time between 1870 and 1900. With technology innovations like steam power and electricity, production skyrocketed suddenly. There was no time to plan for that kind of growth. With this new production came new demands, like the immediate need for more factory workers. Many of these factory workers came from rural areas of the United States, people who moved from agricultural towns into the bigger cities looking for factory work. But even still, more hands were needed. Immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe began to flood into the United States through the New York City harbor, where they were greeted by the Statue of Liberty, which has become a symbol for freedom and opportunity for that reason. I want to call your attention to something that starts our timeline for this chapter. In 1876, professional baseball began with the founding of the National League. 1876, baseball has been around for a while. Then in 1885, Chicago builds its first 10-story skyscraper. We have the invention during this time period that we're talking about also of the electric trolley. We also have people starting to focus on how the other people live. It's not just about being successful and surviving. We have people who are now looking at those who are not thriving in this new society. And we have the Hull House opening in Chicago. We also have an expose published called How the Other Half Lives. And so we'll start seeing people start concentrating on other folks as well. In 1893, the City Beautiful movement begins, and Coney Island Amusement Park opens in 1895. These charts show just how rapidly population grew in the United States in the late 1800s. Much of the growth took place in urban areas, which are defined by the census as 2,500 people or more. And this urban population, particularly that of major cities, dealt with challenges and opportunities that were unknown in previous generations. This photo shows newly arrived immigrants at Ellis Island in New York. Inspectors were examining them for contagious health problems, which could require them to be sent back, actually. One of my favorite things to do is you can actually check the list of people who came over on an Ellis Island website. And for another class that we had previously at the college about organized crime, we were able to see when one of Hot Springs' biggest organized crime leaders, Oni Madden, came to the United States through Ellis Island. It was really neat to be able to see that and to see that who he traveled with and all of that. You can still check that out today. So there's another reason that we had urbanization during this time period. We're talking specifically post-Civil War. There were a lot of African Americans who left the South after the Civil War in order to move north, and so many that this is called the Great Migration. They mostly moved into cities in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. African American men who moved away either to the North or to the Midwest as part of the Great Migration were often stuck in trivial jobs, working in construction or as porters on railways. And it's hard to get ahead with that, but they left hoping to escape the discrimination of the South. I think this time period really shows the creativity of humans, because at the time, trolleys were the most efficient way to travel, more so efficient than horse-drawn carriages anyway. But in really highly populated cities like New York or Boston, there were frequent accidents. And picture A is the image of one such accident that happened in New York. So Boston said, what can we do? Trolleys are more efficient. Excuse me. Trolleys are more efficient, but, we don't want people to get hurt. Hear my dog in the background? Sorry about that, guys. Anyway, so in Boston, they decided to put the trolleys underground. So while we normally associate with subways with New York, Boston was actually the first to do this. So there were 3 different lines that met to enter the Tremont Street subway, which is the oldest subway tunnel in the United States, that opened September 1st, 1897. So again, even though we typically associate subways with New York, Boston was actually the first. We've talked before about how the Industrial Revolution tended to create this idea that if you were willing to work, you could succeed, and that wasn't always the truth. And we start seeing this new kind of focus, or the shift in focus, develop in the late 1800s as people are starting to think about the people who are poor. What can we do to help these people? Until then, it was sort of like, oh, they need to help themselves, and people just moved on. But this photograph here was taken on Mulberry Street in the infamous Five Points neighborhood of Manhattan's Lower East Side, a very poor area. Jacob Riis documented the plight of New York City slums in the late 19th century, and by documenting that in these photo essays, he was able to share these images with the world to say, this is a problem. And so focus began to shift on how can we help people. While Riis on the last slide focused on photography to share images of real-life urbanization problems, there was an emerging art form that also developed. Now, this wasn't an organized art form as such. There were different painters who used different techniques. It wasn't all the same technique or that sort of thing, but different people referred to themselves as ashcan artists to share images of what real life looked like. So these are realist in terms of paintings. Now, the term ashcan came about because it was really kind of this joke when somebody referred to this new form as there were too many images of ashcans and girls with their dresses hiked up showing their legs, so kind of referred to the trashiness of it all. But the artists thought it was kind of funny and clever, so they hung on to it and started referring to themselves as ashcan artists. They were showing real life. Not exactly the kind of thing that many people would have liked to have maybe seen, because then they would have to deal with it. But these artists also began, through depicting real life, started sharing these images, and it required people to face facts that there was a problem with urbanization at this time. There were poor people who needed help. There was overcrowding. There were pollution issues, all those sorts of things. Jane Addams was co-founder of the Hull House, which opened in Chicago in 1889. It was important because it offered services to the city's poor. So the Hull House was part of this women's social movement that began to promote education and autonomy. So not only are these women starting to break into kind of this leadership role that had been previously predominantly male, now they're offering some social interaction for people who are among the poor. The whole idea behind this Hull House was that it was a community of university women who gathered with the main purpose to provide social and educational opportunities for working class people, and many of those were European immigrants. So they offered like social activities, like social club activities. They offered activities for the children, and they gave free lectures to anyone who would come, and it really enhanced the lives of these people who participated in this living quarters situation. I don't know if you saw the recent movie released within the last couple of years called The Call of the Wild. Well, that actually dates back to about this time. The image here that you see is Jack London posing with his dog Rollo in 1885. And Jack London is the actual author of the book that movie was based on. The book tells the story of Buck, a dog who lives happily in California until he's sold to be a sled dog in Canada. Big differences there, right? So the dog must survive these harsh conditions and brutal behavior, but his animal instinct takes over and he prevails. The story clarifies the struggle between humanity's nature versus the nurturing forces of society. Culturally, things start to change a little, and we start to see entertainment develop for the masses. Now, the wealthier class has always had entertainment. They've had theater, they've had music, concerts, that sort of thing. That would have been rather expensive for the general public and especially those considered among the working poor. But with the development of places like Dreamland Amusement Park on Coney Island, that offered amusement to the lower class, the lower social class, if you will. So everyone could afford some kind of entertainment. Plus, as things are going along and we're changing our labor laws, then people have a little more time for entertainment, even those who are among that working class and the working poor. Early in these slides, I mentioned the formation of the National Baseball League, but Boston's Fenway Park opened in 1912 and was really popular for working class people to spend their leisure time because it was inexpensive. The green monster, this iconic left field wall, makes it one of the most recognizable stadiums in baseball even today. So that's how when you hear of baseball being all-American or the American sport, it comes back to that, the fact that so many people could afford to attend a baseball game. The City Beautiful movement is important to us because it shows the consideration of infrastructure. So not only is it important to these communities at this time that are growing, the urban areas, to be able to accommodate all the people who want to move in, we have city planners now who are starting to say, hold on a minute, let's make some green space possible. Let's not forget trees. Let's improve the quality of the surroundings for people who are here. Let's have some green space. Let's have a lake. Let's do, let's have trees. Let's have a little park. Let's give kids a place to play. So this is all part of the City Beautiful movement. And it's important too because cities with those kind of accommodations or amenities would have drawn more people. So we've talked a lot about the effects of the Industrial Revolution and that sort of thing. So when we say machine here, we're not talking about a factory machine, which kind of gets confusing as we're talking about these improvements, that sort of thing. So what we're talking about when we say a political machine is really a process. And it's a process by which citizens of a city use their local ward alderman to work the machine of local politics to meet the needs within the neighborhood. So the machine would be the way the local politics work. So this political cartoon depicts the control of Boss Tweed of Tammany Hall over the election process in New York. So, again, not an actual machine, but more like the process of how things work. So people in their local districts knew who they could talk to for influence in order to get some input into that machine. The question here is, why were people willing to accept the corruption involved in machine politics? So sometimes that's because the machine politics actually worked in their favor. Didn't always work in their favor, but sometimes it did. And when it did, they were willing to accept that because the community got what it wanted and what it needed. Now, some of the people in the machine gained bribes or favors for it, but ultimately the community often got what it wanted. The middle-class family of the late 19th century largely embraced the separation of gendered spheres that had already been part of the market revolution of the antebellum years. So the husband earned money for the family outside the home, while the wife oversaw all the domestic chores. She raised the children, she tended to the family's spiritual, social, and cultural needs. This magazine is called Good Housekeeping, and it was launched in 1885. It still exists today. It capitalized on this middle-class focus on women maintaining a pride-worthy home. Again, still exists today. One of the important things that we could easily overlook here if we don't discuss it is the fact that this magazine is directed toward middle-class women, which means women of the middle class during the late 1800s were reading, many times very literate, and so that's an important development for women of the time period and for families as they would teach their children to read and write as well. And speaking of literacy, education became of higher focus during this time period, and we see that through the Morrill Land Grant Act. Now, the Land Grant Act provided public land to some states or territories for the development of public colleges. So we have, starting now, higher education focus. We have actually in the state of Arkansas, the University of Arkansas and the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff received Morrill Land Act grants. It's hard to say. Anyway, this picture here is of Kansas State University in 1878, and it was an early land grant college created by the Morrill Act. They focused more on preparing students for careers in business, that sort of thing. Most of these were like agricultural and mechanical colleges, or A&M colleges, if you will. They also prepared, though, like I said, for professional careers in business, medicine, law, and that sort of thing as well. So one thing that I find fascinating about this particular information is that one year I had a student in class who had worked for an elevator company, and so he knew this elevator history. And all of a sudden he was like, wow, I can apply this to work. And so he did this special project for class about the development and evolution of the elevator, which was really kind of interesting. So I think it's neat that all along this technology had existed to build super tall buildings, but it just didn't make sense to do so because you would have had to have taken the stairs. So it wasn't until the elevator was actually invented in 1889, the electric elevator, because you could have pulleyed, had that pulley system to get up maybe a couple of flights of stairs, but not anything huge. So the electric elevator in 1889 changed building because now skyscrapers were up for grabs. You could build something 10 floors high like this building in Chicago, or even higher as we see much later, but it's the elevator that was so important to the development of the skyscraper. Don't forget to review the terms to know at the end of the chapter. I've included them here so you can give them a quick glance. Many of them we've already talked about, including the City Beautiful movement and the Great Migration. We've also talked about machine politics, the realism depicted that caused the shift in focus to the poor. And let's see, that should include just about everything. Oh, social gospel was the belief that the church should be as concerned about the conditions of people in the secular world as it was with their afterlife. So that also started changing the way society looked at the poor. I hope you have found something in this chapter that you enjoy, and if not, hang in there. Maybe it'll be the next chapter.